Hello everybody and welcome to today's vlog. Now, as you can tell from the thumbnail, today I'm going to be talking about the Wellington Bomber R1073. Now, I've known about this probably for about 8 or 9 months now, and the reason that it came to being is because if you've seen any of my previous videos on RAF Lindholme, I suspect there to be a 4th Wellington Bomber out here on the moors somewhere. One that didn't return from a bombing raid in Germany. I'm not going to get into the details here, but all of the information is on the vlog entitled Body in the Bog. It's all about the body that was found on the Peat Moors in 1987 and why I believe that that body came from this particular plane, and I do a very, very detailed review of why I think that that plane is out there. So, going on from there, why R1073? Well, a friend of mine went to the National Archives earlier this year and found there evidence of a plane crash, a Wellington Bomber, and sent me all of the details. As you can probably tell, I was seriously overexcited to receive all this amount of information about another crashed Wellington. And I was really interested in the story. However, what actually transpired changed the course of my knowledge of the moors completely and forever. So out on the moors is the beautiful Polish memorial, which is to W5557. That plane was supposed to, well, it did crash on the moors in 1941. However, not where they said that it did crash, which I will get onto a little bit later on. From the information that we gained from the National Archives, this particular site is the resting place of R1073. Now, a couple of weeks ago I did a walking video, and again it was out here on the moors. I'm always out here on the moors, I absolutely love it. So I was out here on the moors and I recorded a walking video where I said that this is R1073, not W5557. And somebody, and rightly so, said, "How do you know?" So I thought, I'm going to have to explain, aren't I? So here it is. Here is the explanation using only documentation from the National Archives to tell you exactly how I know that this plane is not the Polish plane that we think it is, but it is actually R1073. I'm going to start off with the letter from 1981. And the letter from 1981 gives us a little bit of information. And this was the first letter that was found by my friend who was at the National Archives that led to this whole opening of R1073, and a very detailed eyewitness report from the excavation of the plane in 1974. So here goes. This is the full story of R1073 and the tragic death of the 2 very young men that were on board. First, let's start with a letter to a Mr. Kevin Desmond in London. I believe his initial inquiry was about a crashed Wellington, and also, judging by the end of the letter, he's inquiring about the ghost that's often seen around here called Lindholme Willie. So here is the original letter. "Thank you for your letter dated the 13th of January 1981. In June 1974, when employees of Frisons were engaged in digging peat in the bog east of Lindholme airfield, parts of a wrecked aircraft and fragments of bones were found. The discovery was reported to the police and the local coroner, and subsequently a Royal Air Force salvage unit was instructed to investigate the site. The parts of the wreckage found was identified as a geodentic structure of a Wellington, but positive identification of a particular aircraft was not possible. The remainder of the wreckage is thought to be at the bottom of the Peat Moors. The terrain at the wreckage site is fairly typical of the moors. There is a top dry layer of 2 to 3 feet and the remainder is boggy peat and water mixture. Once the top layer of peat is removed, it becomes impossible and acts like quicksand. There we go. Digging on the site had to be abandoned because the deeper the hole became, the quicker it became liquid, and eventually the whole area began to move, making the situation very dangerous. The Royal Air Force team of experts investigating the site recommended the removal of the wreckage near the surface and the holes to be filled. This recommendation was agreed by the department. The human remains were released to the custody of the local coroner who, without reference to the official casualty records, identified the bones on the evidence of a report by a third party as being from a particular lost aircraft whose 2 occupants were recovered and buried in 1942 in St Oswald's Churchyard at Finningley. He then handed the small quantity of human remains back to the Royal Air Force at Lindholme. There is unfortunately no record of what RAF Lindholme, now closed, did with the remains, but if the coroner decided that there were remains belonging to the 2 aircrew members already buried and authorised their disposal, it is almost certain that they would have been placed inside the existing graves. I have checked our file and regret that we know of no one else who is writing a book about Lindholme Willie with whom you could compare notes. Yours sincerely, A.J. Webb. So the next part of this story led me to think 1974 excavation. Where is this plane? So a little bit deeper on, a little bit further on in the story, we come across the full story of a gentleman that was part of the excavation. Now, I've tried many times to be able to edit his words down, and if I do that, the story just doesn't make sense. It is such a precise and in detail report from 1974 that if I edit any of it out, the rest of it just doesn't make sense. So here goes. 71 MU RAF Bicester for the attention of Squadron Leader V. Priestley with regards to the wreckage of the Wellington aircraft Hatfield Moors adjacent to former RAF Lindholme. Just like to say, it wasn't former at the time. During the month of July, I was attached to RAF Lindholme, where I attended number 4 and 5 Royal Observer Corps training camps as an officer of number 14 Group ROC Winchester. At this time, I heard about the discovery of a wrecked Wellington aircraft on the peat bog area owned by Fissons Limited. I have long studied the type and am at the moment researching with a view to ultimately publishing the history of the Wellington and associated designs. I offered my assistance both from a personal interest, also in a desire to help, as I understood that no evidence could be found to identify the aircraft, or more importantly, the identities of the crew who were killed when it crashed. The wreckage had been left on site after the accident because of inaccessibility and was well known locally. But after human remains had been discovered by members of the ROC attending earlier camp periods, also ammunition, the area was sealed off and the police authorities at Thorn were notified, as also was the coroner's office. Flight Lieutenant B. Edwards, I visited the site with a view to trying to establish a positive identification of the aircraft. Other than confirming that the wreckage was indeed a Wellington, little more was possible due to the complete fragmentation of the aircraft and the fact that the wreckage had been extensively disturbed by souvenir hunters over the years. During Wednesday afternoon of Camp 4, I was able to revisit the site and begin to methodically sift the wreckage. The result was a positive identification of type, mark and a good idea of the impact altitude. It was a Mark 1C Wellington built by Vickers Armstrongs Limited at the Chester factory, probably between 1940 and 1941. One confusing piece of evidence was the length of an ammunition track associated with a 4-gun turret, but these were only fitted to later marks of Wellington. This put the identification in some doubt, but subsequent engine components dug out of the water reconfirmed identification. I concluded that this ammunition track must have migrated from a nearby Lancaster wreckage. I visited Thorn Police Station, where I was given access to police records of the war period, but nothing positive was found. All Wellingtons recorded were identified as Mark II aircraft, and another had an incomplete serial number and vague unit identity. Subsequently, this reference was proved to be the aircraft in question, but much later, due to the information generally accepted that the aircraft had been based at Lindholme at the time. At the end of the camp period, I offered my services when the aircraft was subsequently removed from site. Vizens Limited had offered the use of power digging equipment to remove as much wreckage as possible from the water. My offer was accepted by my Flight Lieutenant R. Hopper of 71 MU, and a letter was sent to A and AEE Boscombe Down asking for my assistance during the retrieval period. This, however, was refused, but I undertook to take leave of absence and travelled to Lindholme at my own expense, in the company of Sea-Tech W. Mann and a party of airmen. The site was cleared and the water excavated. Thanks are due to Sea-Tech Mann and his party for the patience afforded me during this investigation. Also to the digger operators, who were most helpful, working long after their normal cease work time. The impact area was established as the port wing striking the ground about 20 degrees towards the horizontal, with the fuselage about 5 degrees over vertical. All wreckage from the port side was contained in a line approximately 20 feet from the fuselage centre line, whilst the starboard side extended approximately half the span of the aircraft, which would have been 44 foot. With wing structure in this area, a line of debris, rear turret wreckage was found below ground at about 10 foot forward of the centre line of the wing structure. The port undercarriage had completely broken up, whereas the starboard was completely even to the tyre. Whereas the starboard was complete even to the tyre. The port propeller was dug out from a depth of 10 foot. It had been under power on impact. All blades had been bent back, also away from the direction of rotation. The rudder trim tab was unearthed still in the neutral position, therefore both engines were functioning at the time of impact. The elevator trim tab was also found to be set fully nose up, but it was not possible to establish flat position. This is important as they are interconnected, giving nose up trim automatically as flaps were lowered. This compensating gear was fitted after early flight trials and suggested it was necessary. Wellington trim tabs are of the irreversible type, cable operated worm gear. Once set, they had to be rotated by cables to reset the tabs. Therefore, the tabs discovered are as they were on impact. Human remains were found embedded in frame 12.5. The frame immediately behind the pilot's seat, suggesting that the pilot was in the seat at the time of the accident. Other remains were found aft the reserve oil tank wreckage that was sighted aft of the main spar, suggesting that a crew member was making his way aft at the time of the crash. No personal effects were found to prove identity, but I did form an impression that probably there were 2 crew on board at the time. This was therefore my subsequent investigation confirmed this thought. Digging had to be abandoned at a depth of approximately 10 feet, as only the top 3-4 feet of the peat was dry. The deeper the hole, the quicker it became liquid. Eventually, the whole area began to move. The digger began to slide inwards, as did myself. At this point the dig was abandoned. There is much more below surface, but as the digger was groping blindly in liquid peat and was pulling itself into the hole, the situation became quite dangerous. The depth of the liquid peat was estimated to be about 30 feet at this point. Before I left Lindholme, Flight Lieutenant Edwards showed me the first aid pack discovered on site of the crash. Cleaning off dirt, painted numbers appeared. As these packs often had unit or aircraft identity painted on them, I took it back to Boscombe Down, where I cleaned it off and inspected it under ultraviolet light. Paint traces suggested the numbers were 225 or 22F. This pack was taken to the Home Office Forensics Laboratory, Aldmanster, the attached statement refers. 2 visits were made to the Public Records Office, also the Air Historical Branch, where Lindholme 304 and 305 squadron record books were analysed without success. Knowing that there was OTU at RAF Lindholme, I searched the station's record book without success. Tracing the unit's bases there at the appropriate time of the accident, at that time it was not even known what year it happened. 1942 was taken as the most accurate because of people's memories suggested it was that year. Eventually, an entry for the 11th of June 1942 in 25 OTU record book stated that Wellington Mark 1C R1073 dived to the ground from 3,000 feet at Lindholme. Crew 934 159, Sergeant B.E. Rook, Captain, and 778 684, Sergeant B.E.F. Jones, were killed. Accident record cards at DFS are now with AHB for the wartime period. These were searched and eventually the card for this accident was found. See attached copy. This stated that the aircraft authorised to carry out circuits and landings had crashed at 13:15 when the pilot disobeyed orders and idled the time away by cloud chasing. The cause was loss of control. A file reference of G5833 was recorded. The pilot had flown a total of 130 hours, 46 on type and 56 on instruments. In an attempt to discover a clue to the accident, I traced the station commander of Lindholme at this time. He now lives in Suffolk and Italy in retirement. He states that he was in his quarter at lunchtime when he was drawn outside by an unusual noise. An aircraft was performing what might be described as a series of involuntary stalled turns, climbing to near vertical and then falling one side or the other, pulling out of the ensuing steep dive only to repeat the manoeuvre. Losing height each time, he failed to pull out of the final dive and hit the ground almost vertically with engines full on. He went out to the scene and found almost nothing left of the aircraft. His description of the spot and the access to it compiles with my knowledge of the area. He subsequently confirmed that he heard 2 or 3 of these manoeuvres and witnessed a similar number. Therefore, the height at onset must have been about 10,000 feet. So, just coming away from his words for a second, we have just walked past some of the remains from the 1974 excavation, which I will go back to now. So under here is where R1073 and some remains of the bodies are still unfortunately interred deep in the peat. That is why this island is still here, why it hasn't been touched. It is really, really, really sad. These here, people think that they were from the rescue of the plane. They were not. The plane was absolutely annihilated upon impact. These sheets here are from 1974 and they were here to try and help the diggers to stabilise sooner than falling in on themselves on this peat bank. I mean, it's such a beautiful place to be, but I can't imagine spending all of eternity down there in the peat. That is pretty awful. I know one gentleman was from Fletcham and the other gentleman was from South Africa, but I will get on to those in a minute. I will continue with the story. In conclusion, the following is a suggestion resulting from the evidence I have collected and my knowledge of the type of aircraft. Previously, I referred to an interconnected flap and elevator trim tabs before lowering flaps. Before lowering flaps, the elevator trim tab control had to be centralised. When flaps were lowered, the trim control moved into the box to fully nose up automatically. If the nose up trim is set, the control, having a set range of movement, reached its limit but was driven further by the flap movement. This resulted in stripping rack and pinion gears in the trimmer box. When flaps were raised, the trimmer control would stay where it was, fully nose. The tabs now at Vista are fully nose up. The aircraft flight altitude was compatible with those control settings. Could the aircraft have been making dummy landings, approaches on clouds instead of cloud chasing? Undercarriage and flaps would have been lowered. Then undercarriage would have been retracted and finally flaps selected up. Had the trimmer box been damaged as described, the resulting flight altitude could have been very similar to that described by Group Captain Garland, particularly if the aircraft was in a tail-heavy loading. Sometimes nose turrets were removed on OTU aircraft. Even in squadron use, they were often not used operationally. Also, there were human remains aft of the reverse oil tank, probably putting him in the rear fuselage. All this conjecture, as the trimmer box was not found, but the elevator tab was. Finally, may I say that this exercise has been a most interesting one, and one that I trust has been brought to a reasonable solution. Although not positively proved, I think the evidence is conclusive enough to satisfy the coroner. I rather expect that the accident has already been dealt with by the coroner's office at the time. Signed, N. Parker. Now I can totally shadow what N. Parker has said here. I have found this all so fascinating. But here's the thing. When I looked at N. Parker's record from the 1974 OTU excavation, and I've also got the crash reference and the crash report. Both of them give an area, like I can't even think what they're called, but on a map you get like an ordnance reference. The ordnance reference is for the crash site it's over there, which is where everybody believed W5557 was. So now I have conclusive proof that that was R1073, because not only did the reports in 1942 put it exactly there, so did the 1974 dig, where they found the human remains to let them know that only 2 people were on the plane at the time of the crash. And if you have watched My Body in the Bog vlog, you will totally know that there were 6 people on board that plane. All of them and their body parts were recovered whole. There was only one person, the pilot, that died on impact, but he was all together. 3 died later and 2 completely survived. That cannot be the crash site there. Their crash site is over there, where that line of trees is, over towards route, because they hit trees coming in at too low an altitude to be able to land. So their exact report says that they were 2 miles away from the end of the runway, which is kind of just over there on the side of that trees. So yes, how do I know that that is sighted incorrectly? Well, because the evidence tells me. It's not easy walking on a peat bog and recording at the same time. I keep sinking. So as per N. Parker's very, very, very detailed surmising of what happened to R1073, he mentioned the coroner's report, and this was to do with the first aid kit that was found, and this was one of the only things that was found that had any kind of mark on it at all, and it was sent to a principal scientific officer. So this is a statement of witness, Michael David Jesse Isaacs. He was over 21 and he was the principal scientific officer, and this was dated the 22nd of October 1974. I am a Master of Science and a Fellow of the Royal Institute of Chemistry. On the 30th of September 1974 I received from Mr. Parker of Boscombe Down a webbing pouch. This bore on the lower front the fragmented outlines of 3 symbols in pinkish paint. These were subjected to microscopic, ultraviolet and infrared examination, but no further traces of a number could be found other than that visible with the naked eye. These traces were in the form of either 225 or 22F. So now going to the website which a friend of mine runs, called Yorkshire Aircraft, I get the full details of the gentlemen that were on board R1073, and here is where it takes for me the most tragic of turns, because these gentlemen were so young. The pilot was 20 and the person that was in the back was only 19. The pilot was English, the chappie in the back was South African. It is such an awful read for men of the age that they were. So Wellington R1073 near Lindholme Airfield, on the 11th of June 1942, the crew of this 25 OTU aircraft were to carry out the basic circuits and landings exercises at Lindholme Airfield and took off from Finningley at 1 o'clock. Before any of the proposed landings could be made, the aircraft went out of control and dived into ground just east of Canberra Cottage Farm, close to the Lindholme boundary, at 1:15 hours. Both airmen on board were sadly killed. Wellington R1073 was built to contract 99242-39 by Vickers Armstrong Limited at Hawarden and was awaiting collection in September 1940. It was received by 22 MU on the 21st of September 1940 and then was taken on charge by 110 Squadron, 110 Squadron, on the 20th of April 1941. The aircraft was transferred to 25 OTU on the 11th of June 1941, and on 19th of August 1941 it was damaged in a minor flying accident. CAT AC-FA damage was the damage assessment, and a repair on site was begun on the 22nd of August 1941. It was returned to 25 OTU on the 13th of September 1941. As a result of the crash near Lindholme on the 11th of June 1942, CAT E2-FA burnt damage was recorded and the aircraft was written off. It was struck off charge on the 19th of June 1942. Pilot Sergeant Brian Edwin Rook, RAF VR, aged 20, of Fetcham, Surrey, buried Finningley Churchyard in the extension at Yorkshire. Air Bomber Sergeant Basil Everard Francis Jones, RAF VR, aged 20, of Zimbabwe, buried Finningley Churchyard in the extension at Yorkshire. I have to read from my phone the exact cause of the crash. It's short to the point and actually puts the full weight of responsibility on the poor 20-year-old pilot. Dived off turn, failed to recover striking ground, pilot disobey orders to do circuits and landings, or idled the flying period by doing cloud chasing. So there you go. There were measures put in place at RAF Lindholme, where the commanding officer of the station took all of the new recruits and told them about this particular incident. I believe some of them were even actually taken out to the wreckage site, but I can't confirm that. That is just something that I was told. But I mean, it would definitely be a wake-up call for people to follow orders. Here are your completely obliterated comrades, purely because they didn't follow orders. So basically, chaps, do as you're told. But you know, at the end of the day, one was 20 and the other was 19. They were in the middle of a war. I mean, it was a pretty brutal time, bless them. Now walked around the moors in almost a complete circle. I'm not far away from the car park again now. If you look at that cream coloured building over there, just to the left of that is the flight control tower. So that would have been the start of the return runway, which is where these two young men should have been aiming towards sooner than cloud chasing. And as you can see over there as well are what are now the condemned hangars, the 5 hangars of RAF Lindholme. But it's lovely to still see them up. I enjoy walking down here for that reason, because it's still pretty much exactly as it was, only a little bit scruffier. Air Bomber B.E.F. Jones, 11th of June 1942. And then pilot B.E. Rook, 11th of June 1942. And who was on the same moor is the unknown airman, an airman of the 1939 to 1945 war, known unto God. Thank you so much for watching. We absolutely love getting out onto the moors and sharing the stories with everybody. We've got loads more stories to come as well, but I must say that these videos do take a long time to put together. We upload every single Thursday at 4 o'clock or sooner. So please do check us out. Hit the subscribe button and also the little bell so you can get notifications of every time we do upload. And we'll hopefully see you next week. Take care. Bye bye.